One of the things, while Jeff has got this started, is the last time I came to speak at the Southeast Texas Tea Party, it was right ahead of the release of my book, Texit. It hadn't even been printed yet. I actually have copies here tonight if anyone wants.
Awesome.
So Jeff badgered me, bring books, so I brought books. Okay, so let's talk about this. And before I get into talking about the Alamo, I want to explain something. When we talk about independence in the Texas Nationalist Movement, people almost immediately jump to the subject of Texas and Texas becoming an independent nation. And while that's fair, it happens to be, I would say, probably the sexiest topic, if you want to call it that, of what we advocate in the organization. What we really advocate for is Texas independence. And if you read our mission, you'll see it spelled out plainly. It says the political, cultural, and economic independence. So when Jeff talks about us being involved in the cultural aspects of this, understand that we view independence as something that is holistic. It's not something we dreamed up. It's not some philosophy that we just randomly developed, nor was it created to give us a bunch of busy work. Essentially, what we view, our philosophy is quite simple. It says that if you gain your political independence, but lose your cultural independence, your cultural uniqueness, your cultural identity, you won't be able to preserve your political independence very long at all. Okay? So let me just show of hands real quick. How many people believe in this statement right here? Texas is a free and independent state. Okay? That's great. I'm in good company. If you did not raise your hand, I won't judge you harshly, but let me share this with you. In January, when the legislature sits, every elected official will raise their right hand and swear an oath to protect and defend those very words, because that's Article 1, Section 1 of the Texas Constitution. Okay? So we're already looking at, from the very basics of Texas being a free and independent state. It's what we want. And so although we talk about primarily the right of self-government, Texas, and all those things that the media loves to pound on us about, and people like to side-eye us about, understand that we view it as something that is whole. And if we don't do what is necessary to protect those elements of our culture and our cultural identity, we will no longer have the capability of self-government, period. Those words, Texas is a free and independent state, could be stricken from the Constitution because people, future generations, won't understand the sacrifice that was made to preserve that principle. Okay, so now that we're all good and we're all on the same page, that you can understand, let me start off by talking about how we got involved in the Alamo.
Well, the way I interpreted your question was, in reality, we're not a free and independent state.
Why do you think I stay so busy?
So I guess, everybody voted yes, but I thought I was being wrong, but I mean, that's how I perceived it, is we're not a free and independent state,
right,
even though we claim to be, because we're subject to the federal laws.
It is what we aspire to, right? And it is that.
Yes. Okay.
Independence, and let me just say this before I move on with my remarks. The reality of it, and this is the reality, this is not just the principle or the philosophy of it. The reality of the situation is that independence is not a single act. Independence is a state of being, right? It's a process. It's something that you are or you are not, okay? And within that, you have those varying degrees of independence. And so when we talk about in our mission, the total, complete, unencumbered political, cultural, and economic independence, what we're talking about is the right of Texans to govern themselves and for Texans to be Texans and not be answerable to forces outside of that would relegate us to subservience. I mean, that's really what it's about. But that being said, before I talk about the Alamo, I want to share a story with you. In the process of all the work that we do across all these different fronts, I came in contact with an author. Imagine that. Occasionally we get these inquiries from these different authors, reporters. I mean, we do a lot of media. But we had an inquiry from a reporter, not a reporter, but an author from Montreal in Quebec. And he's working on a book where he is making a comparison between the spirit of independence in Quebec that led to 2 separate independence referendums and sort of what's going on here with the Texas movement, what the public sentiment is, and all of those things. So he's doing this comparative study. And he's an interesting guy. His name's Jake. As a matter of fact, he's going to be giving a presentation at our legislative action workshop next week. But one of the things that Jake did was he traveled to Texas. He flew to Texas, and then he traveled around by bus. And one of the first places that he went to, he said, you know, look, if I'm going to write about Texas, I have to go to its spiritual home, and that's the Alamo. And so when we met him, he shared a story with me about going there and the plaza being quiet. He said he wandered into a church where some of the remains of the Alamo defenders are interred, and shared that experience. And he said, you know, I get it. But it was about 2 weeks after he got back to Montreal, and he started going over his notes and really just kind of collecting his thoughts. He said, I need you to explain something to me. He said, the plaza was quiet. He said, but you could tell there were a lot of things going on there. He said there was a street preacher out there screaming at people as they walked by. You had protesters out there. You had people drinking beer out there and, you know, taking selfies of them doing shots and all this kind of crazy stuff. And he said, that's not what I expected from the place that is the spiritual home of Texas. And so I had the unfortunate position, I was put in the unfortunate position of having to explain how Texans are very fond of shouting, remember the Alamo, but it doesn't grab the attention and hasn't grabbed the attention of a whole lot of people for a very long time. And how one of the things that we do as an organization is fight to make that happen. So let me just go ahead and detail. This Alamo thing that's going on right now has raised to the public consciousness, right? I mean, you've all heard about sort of this debacle that's going on with the Alamo. But what you probably don't realize is that when our organization was founded in 2005, one of the first things we had to do was go to battle for the Alamo. And it's been raging ever since. This is almost an everyday occurrence for us where we have to deal with something related to the Alamo. So the organization jumped right in to dealing with the Alamo, and oddly enough, the first battle that we really had to fight, the really hard one, was the city of San Antonio wanting to open up the plaza for the sale of beer in beer carts. Okay? Now, let me get something out of the way real quick, just so you understand. For those of you who are not aware, when you go visit the Alamo, when you see the church, and you see the long barracks, and you see that little area that's behind all that, that's not actually all of the Alamo. That's just a very small part of where the defenders died for our right to be free and independent. Okay, so when you're walking around, let me kind of give you just a quick textual tour of the place. If you go stand on the steps over there of the federal building by the Alamo, that's where William Travis caught a bullet to the head on the night that the Alamo fell, and that's where he died. Not before plunging his sword into the chest of one of the invaders, though, but that's where Travis fell. Or the walls where they exchanged fire with the Mexican army. Well, you can go experience that by walking into the Ripley's Believe It or Not Wax Museum across the street, or any of the number of kitschy tourist traps over there. Those places where you see those protesters streaking around in thongs or shotgunning their beers for a selfie, that place is probably somewhere where one of the defenders gave their lives, where they fell in battle. Okay? The Alamo Plaza and the Alamo Complex are all part of what used to be the actual fort that we call the Alamo, that the battle was fought in 1836. So you look at it from our standpoint, anytime we go to the Alamo, we're not just respectful in the chapel. We're not just respectful in the long barracks or back there in the gardens to reflect. We're respectful on all of that. Because this is a place where people shed their blood for our freedom and independence. You know, we were just talking about this. How if you go visit war memorials and battlefields anywhere else in the world, you don't see the kind of things that you see at the Alamo in San Antonio. You don't see them. You don't experience them. Can you imagine for a moment someone tendering an idea seriously to begin allowing beer carts to sell beer on the Gettysburg battlefield? Can you imagine that? I can't. Imagine what the uproar would be. Or what if we, can you imagine what would happen to the politician who decided to, tender an idea to say, hey, let's let kids roast hot dogs on the eternal flame? I mean, what would the outrage be? And it was that same ideology, that same thought process that allowed us to successfully beat down the addition of the beer carts in the Alamo Plaza by saying, what are you going to do next? Set up a Ferris wheel in the state cemetery? I mean, what's going to happen next? If this ground is not sacred enough for you, you're obviously not Texan enough. So that was a battle we fought. Subsequently, we fought a battle to prevent Kanye West. I don't know, is he still popular? Is he still popular with everybody, or is he unpopular again? Because he's been on my crap list since day one, just so you understand. But how he got there is not because his music is derivative and unimaginary. He got there because he had an issue where he decided to have a publicity stunt and project his video, the premiere of his video, New Slaves, on the front of the Alamo Church. Just show up, let's project it. And within 8 hours, we had our people out there. We coordinated with, oddly enough, the state of Texas and what they call their Alamo Guard, the security guards that are out there, and we shut that guy down. But that's the kind of disrespect, because our comeback was, hey, that's great. If he pulls this off, we're going to go to his mother's cemetery where she's buried in Oklahoma, and we're going to broadcast, we're going to project John Wayne's Alamo on her headstone. Because that's what we're talking about. The Alamo is not a tourist trap. The Alamo is a battleground. It is a memorial. It is, in Texas culture, probably the most sacred place, and speaks directly to who we are as Texans. So we fought these battles a lot. Then you get to 2013. And 2013 was when the idea first surfaced to us that they wanted to add the Alamo to the UNESCO's World Heritage Site program. Now, they had been operating this, I'm not going to say in the shadows, because they had some public meetings about it, but let's just say you had a very difficult time finding any information about it at all.
When you say they, who is they?
Yeah, that's what I want to know. Who is they?
That's a great question, because the they is a lot of people. We could start with the city of San Antonio. We could start with we can start with the elements within the city of San Antonio. You can talk about the general land office. The they is not a fixed they. It is a moving target. And I'm going to get to that here in a moment, I promise. And you'll hear me use they a lot because I have to lump them together, because if I listed them all out for each individual heinous act, we would be here for about 6 hours. But that being said, let me move on. So we found out about this project to push the Alamo into the UNESCO World Heritage Site program. Now, I'm pretty sure that we don't have a lot of United Nations fans in the house. Am I right about that?
Yes.
Right.
Okay, we don't have any blue flaggers in here. Okay, so I'm not gonna offend anybody, at least not on that. But when we found out about this, it became kind of the enough is enough moment for us. And so what we did was we issued a list of demands to the city of San Antonio, the General Land Office, the state of Texas, and we said this, just so we are not ambiguous in what it is that we are asking for, what we expect. We're going to give you this list, and here's what it was. We wanted the Alamo battleground restored to its original footprint, to include the original walls. Okay, we wanted the Alamo to be the Alamo, not a piece of the Alamo, not a tourist trap representation of what the Alamo might have been. We wanted the Alamo to be the Alamo. We wanted the Alamo battleground to be closed off to vehicular traffic and vendors, right? I mean, they're not putting bicycle racks at the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., are they?
Yeah.
So why would we allow vehicular traffic on our honored ground where these people actually died? We wanted a museum complex built because the museum complex was extraordinarily important because they had no fixed place in a major way to properly present the artifacts in the story of the Battle of the Alamo and its importance in Texas independence. And more importantly, is we wanted the ownership of the battleground complex, the authority to be transferred back to the state of Texas, not the General Land Office, and placed under either the legislature or the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and we wanted the Daughters of the Republic of Texas restored to their rightful place as managers and conservators of the Alamo. Now, for those of you who don't know, there had been a plan that had been going on for a very long time to edge out the Daughters of the Republic of Texas. For those of you who don't know the backstory of how the Daughters of the Republic of Texas got involved in the Alamo, let me just bullet point it. Short version. In the early 1900s, Adina de Cevallos, does the name Cevallos ring a bell to you guys?
Yeah.
His granddaughter, okay, Lorenzo Cevallos' granddaughter, was very involved in Daughters of the Republic of Texas, and there she was in San Antonio, and she looked at this place where these heroes gave their lives. And she watched it as it was falling into disrepair and how people really didn't care about it. The city of San Antonio could care less, couldn't possibly care less. Vendors, commercial folks were using the what is now the Long Barracks was a warehouse, okay? So in the early 1900s, we were very close to losing what was left of the Alamo. And folks generally don't realize how close we were to losing it. We were extremely close. So Adina de Cevallos got together with Clara Driscoll. Does that name ring a bell to folks? Got together with Clara Driscoll. Clara Driscoll had deep pockets, and what they did was they purchased that property where the church was, where the Long Barracks, and it's a long story and complicated. But it was so shameful to the state of Texas that the two women came in and saved the Alamo that they felt compelled to say, okay, great, the state of Texas will take it over and we'll reimburse you. They were so embarrassed by the fact that the state hadn't taken action to that point that they wound up paying Clara Driscoll all of her money back and taking over that bit of property. So when you hear people talk about the Alamo complex, that's what the DRT saved. And the DRT, as a condition of deeding that property to the state of Texas, said in that deed that the Daughters of the Republic of Texas would forever remain custodians of the Alamo. But in the 1990s, for whatever reason, a move started to begin to edge the DRT out of the process. You know, whether it was internal politics or just some people that really didn't care for the fact that the DRT was representative of our long-term Texian heritage, the move started. In the 1990s, a bill was filed 6 different times to remove the Alamo from the DRT and place it under Texas Parks and Wildlife. Every single time it failed. It just couldn't get any traction. But then something happened. In 2011, legislation was introduced yet again, but this time it was introduced by a Democrat in the House and sponsored by a Democrat in the Senate with absolutely no co-authors and absolutely no co-sponsors, and it passed with flying colors in a Republican-dominated legislature, where the authority of the Alamo was placed under the General Land Office, and the General Land Office then had the opportunity to contract the Daughters of the Republic of Texas for management. Well, guess what? They've been working so hard to edge out the DRT, there was absolutely no way for those guys to be able to submit to those contract terms for contract management. And just like that, the people that saved the Alamo were no longer a part of it. Enter in George P. Bush, the current land commissioner in the GLO, because part of the 2011 legislation put the Alamo under the authority of the General Land Office. Now, let's pause and talk about that for a moment. Do you know how many historical properties, historical sites from the Texas Revolution that the General Land Office has authority over right now? One. Until the Alamo, they didn't manage any historical properties. Zero. None. The General Land Office is there to manage, to own and manage publicly owned land by the state to generate revenue, which then funds the permanent school fund and things like that. That's what the General Land Office is supposed to do. And the surveys, right? The boundaries. But that's their primary purpose, is to take a piece of state property and make money out of it. So they take this historical site, which was already the victim of over-commercialization. They jam it under the General Land Office, who has no experience in managing these types of sites, none whatsoever. And then people are surprised that the GLO wants to squeeze dimes out of it. So the GLO gets management of this thing in 2011, and they get authority over it. They squeeze out the DRT, and they decide, the GLO decides to bring in professional managers. So what do? They go outside of Texas. They hire a CEO named Douglas McDonald. Douglas McDonald gets paid from the Alamo funds, which are passed through from the legislature to the General Land Office, and from the General Land Office to this Alamo CEO, who is not even a Texan, who does not understand exactly what the Alamo means to us. But you see, that's just the Alamo that we know. That's the Alamo that we know. The Alamo that we Texans, by and large, don't really know. The rest of the complex has been under this process of the Reimagine the Alamo project. Now, all of that was set up so I could put this into context and talk about why our 2013 demands were so important. You see, when we knew beyond a shadow of a doubt, when the push came to place the Alamo in the World Heritage Site program, that there was really another motive there. And as part of that, and even before that in 2013, we began to hear this thing called Reimagine the Alamo. Well, I don't need to imagine the Alamo. I don't need to reimagine the Alamo. I'm a Texan. I know what the Alamo is. You know, maybe they want to do something to where I can go to see the Alamo, but they want to reimagine the Alamo. And I always thought that was a very interesting choice of words, right? It wasn't called, they didn't call it Remember the Alamo, or, you know, let's make the Alamo great again. You know, there was any number of things that they could have called it, but the fact that they called it Reimagine the Alamo spoke to, in my mind, the perception that people have about the Alamo. So this Reimagine the Alamo thing started popping up. The push beforehand was to put it into the UNESCO World Heritage Site program. Again, I know we don't have any blue flaggers here, but I think this is important. The reason that triggered us so heavily was because we knew what adding it to the World Heritage Site program meant, not from the standpoint of we think the United Nations stinks and they make bad decisions and they're horrible about managing money, but from a legal and constitutional perspective here in Texas, we knew what that would do. You see, UNESCO as an organization of the United Nations is the creation of a convention, okay? This convention, which is an international agreement, countries sign on to it, it is effectively a treaty. The United States signed on to the UNESCO Convention, they signed on to the World Heritage Site Convention, and in doing so, they have certain international obligations. I can't get you the date, I'd have to go pull up specifically when they signed off on that, but early on, whenever UNESCO was founded, formed, they were, the United States was some of the first ones to beat feet to go sign on to the thing. But in doing so, one of the things you find out is that because it has the effect of a treaty, then that means that the United States federal government is then obligated to enforce the provisions of that treaty internally. Okay, so when we sounded the alarm on this, and we said, if you add the Alamo to the World Heritage Site program, you are taking the Texan away from it, and you are federalizing it on the road to globalizing the site. You're removing all absolute authority and control of the Alamo from the soil of Texas to some bureaucrat in Washington, D.C., who's operating at the bidding of the bureaucrats at the United Nations headquarters. Yes, sir.
You said that the Daughters of Texas, that was a provision in the deed. How can you get around a provision of a deed? That's like a land trust.
This is an issue that is being fought right now.
Okay.
And they're trying to figure out who can go fight it and if they can even fight it. And there's it's complicated. It's a very complex mess. But there were some things that happened between the issuance of the deed and by the time it was actually handed over to the state. So that's a DRT thing. The DRT is going to have to figure that one out. But if I were in the DRT, which I'm the inappropriate gender to be so, although apparently that flies now, I don't know. Gwen, how does that work?
What do you think you are? You can be whatever you want to be.
Yeah, how many genders are there?
There's
the sons, right? But because
I don't think, I'm a member of the DRT, and Donna's seeking to be one. I don't know if anybody else here is, but they're not fighting anymore. They seem to have given up. I mean, they did fight with this lawsuit, and they did win part of that lawsuit. And they sought money for that, and they did win back the library, which was the thing that they were looking to try to get back. But they don't seem to be fighting, and I don't hear them really talking about this. It bothers me. I wish they were.
Well, I'll tell you, it's part of the challenge that that people have with why we're fighting, and I'll explain that here in a moment because I think it's important. But the UNESCO thing triggered us pretty hard. I mean, we're not triggered in the snowflake sense that we needed a cry room at the university, but it let us know that the battle was getting really serious. And so when we came out about this and said, hey, you got to put the brakes on this thing because you're getting ready to hand over final authority of the Alamo to some bureaucrat in D.C. at the behest of UNESCO. Remember, this is the same UNESCO who's done everything they can to rail against the sovereignty of independent nation states like Israel. How do you think? So UNESCO is perfectly they find it absolutely okay to utilize their role in cultural affairs to influence political affairs and make political statements. What do you think the Alamo's going to say to these guys, right? So this is the challenge that we've got. So that really fired us up. The UNESCO thing really got us going. That's why we sent out the 13 issues, okay? Now, when the Reimagine the Alamo plan came out, and while we received a lot of criticism about our criticism of the Reimagine the Alamo plan, or as they love to call it, the less touchy-feely, politically charged statement of the Alamo Master Plan. The Alamo Master Plan, essentially, if you think about the things that I said we wanted, it ticks off all the boxes. It restores the battleground to its original footprint. Great, that's a win for the home team. Closes it off to vehicular traffic and vendors. That's great, it's another win for the home team. Builds a world-class museum, which was a condition, by the way, of getting the Phil Collins collection. I don't know if you guys knew about the musician Phil Collins is a huge Alamo aficionado and had enough Alamo artifacts in his personal collection that he was able to give them over to the Alamo on loan with the condition that they build a museum to house it. So we're going to get a museum. Hey, this is great. We're doing really good, right? We should be exuberant. We should be extremely happy. The UNESCO thing, we're fighting that. We're going to fight that in the legislative session that's coming up. But for some reason, we should all be extraordinarily afraid. Because restoring the Alamo battleground footprint is important. The museum is important. Closing off the vehicular traffic, restoring sort of the sacredness of the site is important. But if at its core, the thing that has changed the most is the story, the narrative of the Battle of the Alamo, then what do those things mean? Why do they matter? Who cares if we have a museum, right? Who cares if it's restored back to its original footprint? Who cares if there's no beer carts, if the story that they're telling future generations is not the right one? Now, before you think that we're being alarmist here, I want to share something with you. And what I believe is really what really makes the Reimagine the Alamo plan the Trojan horse that it is. Because it is a Trojan horse. It's dangerous. Not because of the things that it says it will do, but because of the ideology that it is going to be used as a conduit to steer future generations. I want to share this with you because this came straight from the guys and their Alamo master plan. And here's what it says. One of the big issues that you have to understand, and let me cover this before we get to this issue, and I just want to make sure I've got, yeah, there we go. I want to cover this because I think this is the appropriate time to address the issue of the they, because there's an awful lot of they. What you have at this current time, because the previous days, it's all changed. But the current they, if you want to call it that, the group that we're dealing with, consists of the General Land Office, the City of San Antonio, and 3 separate nonprofit agencies that were created under the auspices of the General Land Office. Okay, now there is a shell game that is essentially being played. And if Jerry Patterson, the former land commissioner, were here, he would love to tell you all about it. As a matter of fact, I guess I'll sneak peek this. We're doing a legislative action workshop this next week, and we just confirmed Jerry Patterson as a speaker. We're going to do a specific panel on the Alamo.
Is it Friday?
It starts Friday. Yeah, it's going
December
to.
11th at 7.
Yeah,
will be-
December the 11th. But you just go. I'll give you the details for our website later, and you can go there and get registered for it to see it. But here's what it boils down to. There's like I said, a shell game being played. You have the City of San Antonio, and when I say the City of San Antonio, I don't just mean the mayor and the city council either. There are a lot of other commissions and committees and subsections of that all feed into the City of San Antonio's side of the table. Then you have the General Land Office on the state side, because by statute, the General Land Office has the authority. The General Land Office has the authority over the Alamo. So the only the person representing all of us on the other side of that table is George P. Bush. But not just George P. Bush. Because one of the things that George P. Bush did was he instituted an additional, there were already 2 nonprofit entities established by the GLO. There was a third one that was established afterwards. And essentially what happened was the Alamo management was placed, although remember it's part of the authority of the General Land Office, all of its employees were placed under this nonprofit agency. And so Bush was able to shift what they call FTEs, or full-time employees, off of the books of the General Land Office into this nonprofit and claim that he reduced the budget for the General Land Office when all he did was pass it through to a nonprofit that he actually runs. So that's the kind of shell game stuff that we're playing with. And it's even more than that. You have the Alamo Endowment, which raises money for the operation of the Alamo. And then you have this other third nonprofit that we can't really get a clear picture of what it is exactly supposed to do. But here's the problem with that. Because so much of this work is done through these nonprofits, it's not susceptible to Texas public information requests like it would if it were managed directly by the General Land Office. So you and I can go and say, well, look, we want to find out more information about this. And they can say, well, that's managed by the nonprofit. Well, we still want to see it. And they can say, sorry, you're not entitled to it. And unfortunately, they've been backed up in this by the courts because most of what they do is governed under the provisions of the Texas Public Records Act that deal with, they don't have to disclose contract information that would infringe on competitive contracts, okay? So much of what's been going on, so much of the criticism George P. Bush has gotten about the GLO's management deals with the lack of transparency. As a matter of fact, there was an internal audit that was done in the General Land Office that George P. Bush said was leaked and said that it was completely bogus. He even called it fake news. It was later found out when the audit was actually released that it was exactly the same information, even though he said it was all fake. But what it did was the internal audit said that most of what the GLO was doing in relation to the Alamo and the nonprofits was likely illegal. All of that information has been turned over to Ken Paxton, the Attorney General, who so far has refused to do anything about it. So, you know, this is the kind of shell game system. When we talk about a they, it's a lot of players. There's a lot of different players, organizations, agencies that are involved in this, which gets me to this point. As they began the Alamo Master Plan, one of the things that they wanted to make absolutely sure they did was that they were as inclusive as possible. Okay, now, I'm pretty sure we all know a lot of times that inclusiveness is progressive speak for, well, anything that's well established and heroic and all of those sorts of things. We really can't talk about that. We got to make everybody feel okay. And so this idea that they wanted the Alamo story to be very inclusive and this process to be inclusive, I think should send up some red flags. But the biggest red flag started right off the bat when they went out and they hired, for this Alamo Master Plan, they hired a designer, and his name was Richard Scarmaeus. You guys probably don't know that name. I didn't know it until he cropped up. But in an article with the San Antonio Express News, once they picked him, one of the things that came out was that he had no idea really what the Alamo was all about when they hired him. Okay, now this is the guy who's going to completely redesign the Alamo experience for all of us, right? He has no idea. So his first act on the job was to hire a team of people to educate him about the Alamo, to help him understand what it was. So, typical government brilliance. Let's hire a guy who has no idea what this is all about. Now, he has a great pedigree. He's actually gone out and he's done some design work for other monuments around, all over the United States. But when you talk to the people that are staunch traditionalists, constitutionalists, conservatives, about the work that he did, one of the things you find out right off the bat is that wherever he goes, the story getting watered down follows right behind it. But that was the first sign. But then you go in and so you start looking at some of the other things. Like one of the things that we did, and it's available, we have a report you can download on the website. It's like 300 pages of supporting material. I mean, it's massive. It's a massive information dump. But one of the presentations that they gave, this should make your blood curdle. One of the early presentations that they gave about what their initial design concepts were for the Alamo included a slide that said this. As they're presenting a timeline of where the Alamo falls in, they had a slide that said, the Mexican-American War ends with the sale of Texas to the United States. I don't remember Texas being purchased by the United States. I mean, there's that little sliver we sold them for some war debt. But do you guys remember that? Do you guys remember getting sold to the United States after the Mexican-American War?
How can he do that?
It's our tax dollars paying him, so.
Artistic license.
Yeah, but that slide kind of, I mean, I think that's not a typographical error, right? That is someone who has no idea conceptually of what the history is. So Scarmaeus, throughout this process, they parade him out and he gets interviewed by the media. Here's one from San Antonio Express News. He was asked why not restore the Alamo to its 1836 appearance? Because that's been part of the process. It's like, okay, look, you guys are hell-bent on making the Alamo, an experience. We've got our wish list. You guys have some things you want to do. So obviously one of the things that comes up, and it came up in some of the public meetings, is why not restore it to its 1836 appearance? Look, we're going to restore the battlefield, right? We're going to give it the same footprint. Why not make it look like the way that it was when the battle was fought? And here's what he said. He didn't talk about the practical concerns. He didn't talk about how, well, you might have some security problems with a wooden palisade. He didn't talk about any of the practical aspects or the logistics. This is his quote. He says, "The events of 1836 were just one small chapter in 10,000 years of history." Got to take a drink on that.
He needs to be put in a mental institution.
Yes, it does.
So now you have the head, the guy in charge of design, the redesigning of the Alamo, designing, as they call it, the Alamo experience, who believes that Texas was sold to the United States at the end of the Mexican-American War, and that what we know as the Alamo, or as he referred to it, the events of 1836, we like to call it Texas Revolution, but the events of 1836 were just one small chapter in a 10,000-year history. Now, let me just stop real quick. And let's think about this. The city of San Antonio, until two ladies with courage and grit stepped in and saved it, right? So the Alamo was going to go away, except for the fact that these two ladies, through sheer tenacity and grit, saved it. Because the city of San Antonio, had it been left up to them, that place would be a CVS right now. Okay? And so now we have this where these ladies in their organization, they manage it, they're faithful, they understand what it means, they understand why it's important. And now you have these guys come in who, under the guise of reimagining the Alamo, envision all of that as one small chapter of a 10,000-year history that none of them can tell us what the 10,000-year history is.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we understand that beforehand there were some folks there that we understand the mission period. We know it was a mission. We know it was an abandoned mission and fell into disrepair. We know that there are probably graves on that site. As a matter of fact, we've got the documentation to show where some of the Canary Islanders are buried there. We know those things happened. But were it not for the Battle of the Alamo in 1836, it would not matter as much to Texans. But to him, that is a small chapter in the 10,000-year history. He believes the whole thing should be told, and I'm great with that. But let's keep the main thing, right? But lest you think that this is just an aberration, right? You know how these artsy guys are. They love to shoot off at the mouth. I mean, I've never seen a picture of the guy, but in my mind, every time I hear his name, I picture him looking like Andy Warhol, but only cross-eyed. But that's another story. But here's another one. Again, San Antonio Express News. This is what he said. This was in 2016, by the way. He says, and this is a quote, "No single entity has an exclusive ownership of the entire site, the plaza and shrine, and its grounds," which from a legal standpoint is absolutely true. But here's what he says. He says, "It's our obligation to listen to all voices, opinions, and views before we begin the planning process." Now, I want you to bear in mind that there had been probably 3 to 4 iterations of their proposed plan before he ever said that. That committees had been meeting in San Antonio with the blessing of the General Land Office, this Alamo Planning Committee, over this and working on this before he said that. So, although he's pretending as though the planning process hasn't started, these conversations were already being had. This was in response, I can imagine, to criticism he was getting, right? Especially from people like us. But here's, again, what he said. It's our obligation to listen to all voices, opinions, and views before we begin the planning process. So let me tell you a little short story. Let me do a little aside here real quick. every time the Texas Nationalist Movement would send a representative to one of their public meetings, in one of them we delivered 35,000 petition signatures that were gathered online in 48 hours ahead of one of their meetings to protest something they were doing. We were shut down, as were any other dissenting voices, every single solitary time. If they gave time for public input, they sat there, they stared into space, they nodded, they got up, they played on their phones. So if it's important for them to listen to all voices and opinions, why is it only the people that have certain opinions or certain voices that agree with what it is they're trying to do are important? So when you hear the general land office, especially George B. Bush, talking about they had all this public input, I'm here to tell you in the most East Texan terms possible, that is a load of bull crap. Their public input process was as great as their transparency of the financials over this project. So you want to see how this plays out. You want to see how this has expressed itself. Recently, I say recently, it's been going a long time, so probably a year or so ago, they released the final draft, it was probably a little bit last year, the final draft of the Alamo Comprehensive Interpretive Plan. Okay? Notice what it was titled. Alamo Comprehensive Interpretive Plan. You see, in their minds, they believe that they have to interpret the site and the meaning for people who go there. And I understand it's interpretation. I mean, you know, presentation. I get it. But they believe that they have to take what actually happened and translate it into something so that people can understand it better and feel more included in the story. But here's what should really kind of flip your wig here. Here's a quote. It says, additionally, over the last 20 years, perspectives on cultural identity and contextual history have evolved, allowing for a comprehensive and inclusive story using evidence-based research. While the 13-day battle at the Alamo in 1836 is clearly the best known and celebrated segment of history at the site, it is critical that multiple cultural perspectives and stories be presented. So what they're saying is, yeah, we get it. Well, a lot of people know about this. But really what we need to do is we need to really tell a more balanced and inclusive story. I mean, we get the 13-day battle's kind of important, but, you know, isn't the hotel next door that had the first transgender bathroom even more important? You know, and that's just an exaggeration, but that's sort of what they're getting at, right? So I firmly believe, absolutely, that this Reimagine the Alamo plan is a Trojan horse. It is here to sneak in a destructive ideology that didn't start with this attempt to reimagine the Alamo. And I'm going to give you a quote here. Because two of the big players in getting the Alamo as part of the World Heritage Site program were the Castro brothers. You guys know who I'm talking about,
Yes.
right? Okay, the Castro brothers.
The communists.
Yes.
I used to live in San Antonio.
So you know, you're familiar with the Castro brothers. For those who are not familiar, I'm going to tell you a little bit about their upbringing real quick. Here's a quote. This came from Fox News, December 23rd, 2015. Here's the quote in the article. It says, Maria del Rosario Castro, the mother of former San Antonio Mayor Julian Castro, said in 2010 that she grew up being told the battle was glorious, only to learn the so-called heroes were really, and this is her quote, a bunch of drunks and crooks and slave-holding imperialists who conquered land that didn't belong to them. So if you want to understand not just the root of this, but where this is headed, you only have to look at that quote. You see, while she had the gumption to say it, even though I vehemently disagree with it, the people, a lot of the people that are influencing this process harbor very similar views. They harbor very similar views, probably a lot of them the exact same views. They just don't have the gumption to say it. But what they're doing is they are preparing to say it in the worst way possible. And that is through their reimagination of the Alamo. So yes, it's wonderful. We're going to get a museum. We're going to get it restored to its original footprint, right? We're going to get some hallowedness restored to the place where these defenders fell. But what we're not going to get is any safe assurance from those in charge right now that the narrative and the story of the Alamo will remain intact. The future generations that visit the Alamo, will they be able to understand what those people died for, why they even fought? And if you think it's a problem, look at what happened with the State Board of Education recently, where a committee on the State Board of Education made the recommendation that the heroism of the defenders of the Alamo be struck from the curriculum. Because they said that the word hero is a value-charged word. Well, I'm going to tell you what, folks. I'm a Texan. The Alamo is Texan. And those men who fought and died there, and those women who were there that survived, like Susanna Dickinson, those are heroes to me. Susanna Dickinson is my wife's personal hero. She has a painting of Susanna Dickinson in the Alamo hanging in the living room. Imagine for a moment you're Susanna Dickinson and your husband is out there with all these other men, outnumbered thousands by thousands. And you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that he is going to die. And you chose to remain where he was with your child. That's heroism. And so what if it's value charged? It doesn't matter. But this is the kind of thing that we're looking at. People like Susanna Dickinson and William Travis and Jim Bowie and David Crockett and Burleson and all those, all of these, Dickinson, all these guys that are inside the Alamo are viewed by a lot of these people as imperialists, as drunks, as crooks, as slavers. And apparently, according to the people that are doing this plan, their voice has the same kind of weight as mine or yours. And it's sad. But here's the thing. We got stuff we can do. But the thing is, we're kind of late in the process. People in Texas are waking up to what's happening, and they're understanding what this scenario could play out to look like. And while we had an opportunity to deal with the George P. Bush issue in the primaries in the general election, unfortunately, those failed. So now we are relegated to one last pitched battle. How fitting for defending the Alamo, right? And I'm all right with that. Draw the line in the sand, I am there. We're going to fight this Alamo thing tooth and nail. We're going to fight this thing harder than we've ever done before. And our battleground for those of us who care about what happens to the Alamo is this upcoming legislative session. I was on the phone with State Senator Bob Hall today. State Senator Bob Hall has filed a bill. It's called SJR2. He is proposing a constitutional amendment that the people of Texas will get to vote on that will take it out from under the General Land Office and place it under the oversight of the Texas legislature, which frankly at this point is the way to go. I've heard that there are other bills that are in the process of being drafted that will take the Alamo and restore the Daughters of the Republic of Texas to their rightful place in management of the Alamo. I've heard of other legislation that will claw back, and if you can believe this, I never told you this, did I? The Reimagine the Alamo project, it's a $450 million project, right? That's due to come straight out of the state coffers. And the other thing I didn't tell you about that is that the Texas legislature, after denying it in the regular session, added a $75 million payout to the General Land Office for this project, sight unseen, in the special session.
Out of the rainy day.
Out of the rainy day fund. So when we talk about being fiscal conservatives, understand that it was Jane Nelson and a whole cadre of conservatives that were perfectly fine pulling the money out of the rainy day fund to hand George P. Bush a blank check on a project that had not even been finalized yet. So they're well on their way to having the money to make this happen.
Where does Abbott stand in that?
Well, that's a great question. We keep asking and he keeps saying nothing. And we're not the only ones asking. So
He's not with you.
I would say that anyone who, at this point, anyone who is not inside the walls of the Alamo with us is not with us. You know, there's no room for us when it comes to the Alamo. There's no room for spectators, right? That's not how we're going to win this thing. So we've got time. Let me get through this, so you got, and then I'll take some questions. But here's the bottom line: the legislative session is coming up. Bills are already being filed. If the Alamo matters to you like it matters to us, we have to have all hands on deck in this session. Okay, so if you go to our website at tnm.me, that's tnm.me, you'll actually see a link on there on our campaigns for the Alamo. It says Defend the Alamo. There, you give the information, you get the report, we spit it out to you, and then you'll have all the action, but it'll allow us to stay in touch and coordinate activities. It's not just the TNM. There are activists all over Texas right now that are gearing up for this fight in the legislative session. While there's been a lot of talk about the cenotaph perhaps being moved and restored, a lot of the focus went there, and unfortunately allowed a lot of these other things with the Alamo to slip by. And so now here we are entering into the legislative session, and we've got a shot to make this happen. We've got legislators like Bob Hall, like James White that we've talked to, like Brandon Creighton, State Senator Brandon Creighton. You guys know Brandon. You know, Steve Toth, who's getting ready to go back in. I mean, there are guys, Kyle Biederman, there are guys that are ready to go to war over this thing and get this legislation filed. But I'm going to tell you, this session's going to be a doozy. And so the squeaky wheel is going to get the grease. And that means that we got to do a lot of squeaking if we want to get this thing done. Great legislation out there that's coming about. We'll share that with you at some point. But let me finish up with this, and then I'll take questions. I want you to understand, back to the very beginning, why this is so important. You know, I know when I asked Jeff how long, when he asked me to do this, I said, how long do I have? He said, you know, you got the hour. I said, that's not enough time. This thing has been happening for years. It is so complex and so interwoven, and there's so many moving pieces, and that's how they've been able to get away with this for so long. But I look at this and I say, why is it that the Alamo defenders died? Do we know? You know, if you read Travis's letter that everybody, remember they brought it out and everybody, if you read that, one of the things it doesn't tell you is why they were willing to die. And so to find inspiration for that, I came across a letter that Travis wrote from the Alamo. Doesn't get much play. We don't make school children learn it. Maybe we should. Most people don't know it, but this is what he says. He wrote a letter to Jesse Grimes, and it was March 3rd. Okay, so the Texas Declaration of Independence had already been signed on March 2nd, but it was 3 days before the Alamo fell. And this is what he said. He says, let the convention go on and make a Declaration of Independence, and we will then understand, and the world will understand what we are fighting for. If independence is not declared, I shall lay down my arms, and so will the men under my command. But under the flag of independence, we are ready to peril our lives 100 times a day. So, folks, it is Travis's challenge to each and every one of us. Those men were already challenged, and they met the challenge, and they paid for it. But if we're going to protect that legacy of their sacrifice for liberty, and as Travis said, for independence, then we owe it to them to give whatever time is necessary to make sure that legacy lives on, not just for us, but for future generations. I firmly believe that if the Alamo falls this time, then Texas as a whole will fall. Because future generations will grow up and they will never know what freedom and independence are for Texas. So I want to thank you for your indulgence tonight on a very massive topic. It's as I said, it's a very weighty topic, and there's a lot of pieces. So I will take whatever.